On a quiet Saturday morning in Crestwood, Texas, what began as a man taking out the trash exploded into a showdown that stunned an entire block. Two fake enforcers and a self-proclaimed neighborhood chief thought they could intimidate the wrong driveway until a senior FBI agent revealed who he really was. You won't believe how fast power shifted. Stay tuned, hit subscribe, like, and share this story with your friends today. The sun had barely risen over Crestwood, Texas on that early Saturday morning when the quiet rhythm of suburbia seemed as steady as a heartbeat. The kind of morning where sprinklers ticked across perfectly trimmed lawns, where the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, and coffee brewing in kitchens, where children's bicycles rested on their sides at the edge of driveways like waiting companions. It was just past 7 o'clock a time when silence ruled the cul-de-sac, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower blocks away. In this calm, ordinary setting, Malcolm Hayes pushed open the door of his two-story brick home and stepped out into the golden light. Dressed simply dark sweatpants, a t-shirt, and an old pair of running shoes, he carried a black trash bag in one hand, the weight shifting slightly as he walked toward the curb. To his neighbors, Malcolm was polite, but reserved. He waved, he nodded. He offered a kind word in passing, but rarely lingered in conversation. Many saw him as a man who valued peace and routine, a man content to keep his world small. What they didn't know, or had only guessed, was that behind his calm demeanor and watchful eyes, Malcolm was no ordinary homeowner. He was a senior agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a man who had stared down cartels, dismantled criminal networks, and survived high-stakes operations in cities far from Crestwood. Yet this morning, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was only thinking about dragging his trash to the curb before the truck came rumbling by. But before he could take 10 full steps from his front door, Malcolm noticed something wrong. 3 figures stood at the edge of his driveway, their presence so unnatural it broke the morning's rhythm. They weren't neighbors out for a walk, or kids riding early on bikes. They were grown men in black tactical vests. Their gear mismatched their posture, too stiff, too rehearsed. Stitched across their chests in crooked patches were the words, "Neighborhood Enforcement," bold white letters on cheap fabric. Between them stood Judith Kramer, the self-styled neighborhood chief. Judith had made herself known in Crestwood over the years, not through kindness, but through control. In her 60s, with sharp eyes that had grown used to scanning every lawn, every mailbox, every driveway, she was the type of woman who mistook surveillance for leadership. People whispered about her constant complaints, her threats of fines, her self-appointed authority. To some, she was simply a nuisance. To others, a menace with too much time and too little restraint. And now, on this calm morning, she had not come alone. She had brought muscle 2 imposters dressed as if they belonged to a unit that didn't exist. Malcolm slowed his steps, the trash bag dangling loosely from his hand, his gaze narrowing as he studied them. It was instinct, the same instinct that had saved his life in alleys overseas, and safe houses where the wrong twitch could mean an ambush. He noted everything in seconds. Derek, the taller man, bald head gleaming in the sunlight, mirrored shades hiding his eyes, boots scuffed like they'd been picked up second-hand from a pawn shop. Sean, the shorter one, carried himself with less certainty, his vest slightly too small Velcro straps, dangling his bearded face, betraying nerves he was trying to mask with a stern jaw. And then there was Judith standing between them like she was commanding a squad. Her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a line of grim satisfaction. She wasn't smiling. Judith never smiled when she thought she had the upper hand. For her, this was vindication, a public display of what she considered order. To Malcolm, it was theater, the opening act of a play he hadn't bought a ticket for. He let the bag drop gently onto the driveway, with a muted thud, resting his hands on his hips, as if giving himself the moment to breathe before the confrontation began. In truth, he wasn't rattled, not yet. His years in the bureau had taught him how to slow down time, how to take in every detail, how to separate the real from the fake, before the first word was even spoken. These men weren't law enforcement. He knew that in less than 3 seconds. Their vests screamed costume, their stance screamed insecurity, their silence screamed fear. But what unsettled him most wasn't their presence. It was Judith's. She wasn't a fool, not entirely. She knew the rules of the neighborhood, knew the limits of her so-called position as chief. And yet, here she was, standing at the edge of his driveway, as if she had summoned her own private militia. That meant she was desperate. That meant she had crossed a line long before she even opened her mouth. "Mr. Hayes." Judith began, her voice sharp, rehearsed, dripping with the authority she imagined herself to have. "We need to talk." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his voice calm, smooth, a deliberate counter to her brittle tone. "About what?" Derek stepped forward, boots scraping against the concrete, his height meant to intimidate. "Neighborhood enforcement," he said flatly, his mirrored shades reflecting Malcolm's steady gaze. "You're in violation of community regulations. We're here to detain you until police arrive." The words fell like a stone into still water ripples of absurdity spreading outward. "Detain me?" Malcolm almost let out a laugh. Instead, he repeated the word low and measured like a man humoring a child. "Detain me." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to remind anyone listening that he wasn't the one under threat here. Judith crossed her arms tighter, nodding toward the two men as if to reinforce the illusion. "You've ignored repeated notices, Malcolm. This has gone too far. We can't have someone undermining the rules of this community. These men are here to make sure you comply." Malcolm's eyes flicked from Judith to Derek to Sean, his brow lifting slightly. The calm curve of his lips almost passed for amusement. "And what exactly are the charges?" he asked, his tone cutting through the silence like a blade. Sean fumbled with a folded piece of paper from his vest, his hands less steady than he wanted them to appear. "Property violations, non-compliance, unauthorized modifications to your driveway, loud gatherings." "The list goes on," he muttered, his eyes darting nervously toward Derek as if seeking validation. It was almost laughable. A driveway. Gatherings. These were the weapons they chose. Malcolm's shoulders squared, his posture steady as steel. He had faced down men armed with rifles, men backed by international crime syndicates, men who could vanish into the underworld with the snap of their fingers. And now here he was, staring at two frauds with Velcro straps dangling off their vests, and a neighborhood chief who mistook intimidation for justice. But he didn't rush. He didn't reveal his badge, his title, his years of training. That wasn't his style. Instead, he let silence do its work. Silence had power more than most people realized. And in that silence, something shifted. Curtains across the street fluttered. A face appeared at a window. A teenager with a phone lifted it just high enough to capture the scene. The neighborhood was waking up not just to the morning, but to the spectacle unfolding in Malcolm's driveway. The stage was set. The calm morning had cracked, and confrontation now hung thick in the air. What began as a simple task, a man carrying out the trash, was about to transform into something far bigger. The balance of power was teetering, and every second that passed pulled more eyes, more witnesses, more judgment into the mix. Malcolm could feel it, the way a storm builds long before the first drop of rain. Judith thought she had written the script. Eddie and Sean thought they were the enforcers. But Malcolm Hayes knew the truth. They had chosen the wrong driveway. The silence after Judith's brittle declaration did not stretch long. Before Malcolm could even take a breath, the taller of the two men stepped forward, his boots dragging against the concrete like an actor missing his cue. Eddie, his name would be overheard, later muttered in frustration by his partner, was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, head shaved to a shine that reflected the morning sun, mirrored aviators, hiding eyes that refused to meet Malcolm's steady gaze. He projected aggression in the same way a dog bares its teeth, loud, visible, but unconvincing when you knew the difference between bluff and bite. He squared his stance, puffed his chest, and placed a heavy hand against the Velcro strap of his vest, as though the gesture itself might lend weight to the authority he was trying to project. The words, "neighborhood enforcement," stretched across his chest like a bad joke stitched in haste. For anyone who had ever seen a real badge, a real uniform, the patch looked like what it was, a cheap counterfeit, the kind you could order for $30 on the internet. Beside him stood Sean, his polar opposite in both build and demeanor. Shorter by at least 6 inches, with a thick beard that looked less like deliberate grooming and more like neglect. Sean shifted his weight from foot to foot, as though the asphalt under Malcolm's driveway burned his soles. His vest was clearly not fitted for him. One strap hung loose, flapping in the morning breeze, the side panel too tight across his torso so that it pulled awkwardly with every breath. His boots told another story. Their cracked leather and worn heels betrayed not hours of training, but hours of second-hand use, purchased from a surplus store or pawn shop, anything that could give the appearance of legitimacy without the substance. His eyes, unlike Eddie's, were visible, darting with uncertainty, betraying a man who had not expected to be standing under the weight of so many watching eyes. Together, they looked less like trained officers and more like children caught raiding their father's closet, playing dress-up in tactical fantasies they did not understand. And yet, they stood there shoulder to shoulder, with Judith trying to project the illusion of order. Eddie's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was rigid, brittle, rehearsed. "Neighborhood enforcement," he declared flatly, his tone meant to intimidate. "You're in violation of community regulations. We're here to detain you until police arrive." The words dropped heavy but hollow like stones tossed into shallow water. Malcolm let them echo in the quiet morning air, his expression calm, unreadable. He did not flinch, did not even blink. His stillness was deliberate, a trained stillness that unsettled those who thought bluster was power. He simply tilted his head, repeating the phrase as though testing it on his tongue. "Neighborhood enforcement," he said slowly, evenly. "And you believe that gives you the right to detain me?" Eddie's chin lifted mirrored shades, flashing the reflection of Malcolm's steady posture. "That's right." He snapped, his bravado swelling like a balloon straining against too much air. "You can come peacefully, or we can make it harder on you." Sean's throat bobbed, his Adam's apple jerking visibly. He pulled a folded paper from his vest, the edges creased and smudged, the ink faded, as though it had been printed off a home office printer and folded too many times in a nervous hand. He fumbled it, open eyes, scanning the lines, as though even he didn't believe the words he was about to read. "Violations," he muttered, his voice less forceful than Eddie's, his eyes flicking between the page and Malcolm. "Non-compliance with regulations. Unauthorized modifications to your driveway. Noise complaints." The list goes on. The list went on, but its authority went nowhere. To Malcolm, the words sounded like the desperate recitation of a student who hadn't studied, throwing half-remembered notes into the air and hoping one would stick. It was flimsy, transparent, and laughable, but Malcolm did not laugh. He only let his lips curve faintly, almost imperceptibly, into a smile that carried more weight than a shout could have. For him, the absurdity wasn't in the accusations. He had endured worse attacks on his character in boardrooms and courtrooms. It was in the presentation. Here were two men posturing as enforcers with nothing but mismatched vests and unconvincing papers, trying to project the might of authority they had never earned. Around them, the neighborhood was awakening. Curtains twitched again. A window slid open somewhere across the street. The sound of a phone camera clicking into record mode cut faintly through the breeze. And then, from the corner of his eye, Malcolm caught the flash of movement. Darius Coleman, the teenage boy who often shot hoops down the block, lifting his phone high, whispering excitedly, "I got you on live." The world was no longer confined to the edge of Malcolm's driveway. The performance had an audience, and the audience was multiplying with every second. But Eddie and Sean seemed unaware of how fragile their illusion looked under the scrutiny of cameras. Eddie's chest heaved with false confidence, his fists flexing as though every muscle in his body was straining to convince not Malcolm, but himself, that he had control. Sean, on the other hand, betrayed the cracks in their facade with every glance he stole toward Judith. His shoulders slumped under invisible weight, his lips pressing together to hide words he dared not say aloud. "This doesn't feel right. We're not supposed to be here." Malcolm read all of it, every twitch, every flicker, every tremor. He had sat across tables from men who thought they were untouchable, who believed guns and gangs made them immortal. He had stared into the eyes of killers and liars and cowards, and he knew what real resolve looked like. What he saw now was not resolve. It was desperation, dressed in black nylon and Velcro. It was insecurity, stitched into cheap patches. It was theater, a dress rehearsal staged on the wrong driveway. And so he didn't rise to their bait. He didn't shout, didn't gesture, didn't match Eddie's aggression. He let their unconvincing show collapse under its own weight. He stood calm, feet, planted hands loose at his sides, the very picture of a man who understood something they didn't, that real authority does not need to announce itself with costumes or counterfeit scripts. Real authority speaks in silence, in composure, in the kind of calm that makes aggressors falter. Judith, sensing the unease in her recruits, leaned in sharply, her voice slicing through the air. "Don't talk to me about authority, Malcolm. You've ignored warnings. You think you're above the rules because of who you are. These men are here to make sure you finally learn accountability." Her words might have sounded strong to her own ears, but to the neighbors listening behind glass and through recording devices, they sounded hollow, tinged with desperation. Malcolm caught the slip in her tone, the faint quiver of frustration wrapped in false resolve. His eyes narrowed just slightly, catching what she likely hadn't meant to reveal. This wasn't about rules, not really. This was about power. This was about Judith's need to impose her will, to remind the block who she thought was in charge. But what she hadn't realized, what Eddie and Sean had not prepared for, was that their show of power was too thin, too flimsy to stand against the truth. Their sloppy uniforms, their second-hand gear, their trembling words, all of it was unraveling in real time. And Malcolm, the man they thought they could intimidate, was not just a homeowner. He was a senior FBI agent, a man who had seen power wielded both lawfully and unlawfully, and who knew better than anyone else that fake authority collapses the moment it is tested. The performance was cracking, and the neighborhood was watching. The calm morning of Crestwood had become a stage, and Eddie, Sean, and Judith were actors in a play destined to fail. Judith Kramer's lips tightened into the sort of smile that wasn't a smile at all, more like a crack in plaster revealing the steel beams beneath. She stepped forward just enough to make herself the centerpiece of this performance, her eyes flicking toward Eddie and Sean, as if to remind them they weren't here to think, they were here to follow. Her voice rose sharp and commanding, breaking the morning stillness like glass shattering on tile. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her words coated in brittle authority. "This is not the first time you've been warned. You've ignored repeated notices, and this neighborhood cannot and will not tolerate your continued disregard for the rules we all live by." She paused, allowing herself the drama of a judge pronouncing a sentence, then raised her chin higher. "You have altered your driveway without approval. You've failed to pay required fees on time, and you host gatherings that disturb the peace. The complaints are on record, and today we are enforcing the consequences." The words rolled out like charges in a courtroom, though every syllable sounded more like theater than law. Driveway alterations, late fees, too many visitors. Malcolm almost felt his lips twitch into a smirk, though he kept it locked behind his calm exterior. These weren't violations worthy of a staged detention. They were petty grievances dressed up as crimes. He let Judith's voice echo through the street, her brittle confidence carried on the warm Texas air, while neighbors shifted behind curtains and phones. Her accusations weren't just falling on Malcolm, they were being broadcast, documented, weighed by every unseen jury member watching from behind glass. Eddie, eager to match the sharpness of Judith's tone, stepped forward with renewed bravado. His boots scraped against the concrete as he shoved his mirrored shades higher up the bridge of his nose. From the pocket of his vest, he produced a folded sheet of paper crumpled and worn, the corners smudged with sweat. He held it up like a sacred text, thrusting it toward Malcolm, as if its flimsy weight could justify the performance unraveling around him. "Here it is." Eddie barked, his voice straining against the edges of false authority. "Official documentation. Neighborhood enforcement has every right to detain you until police arrive." He shook the paper for emphasis, the thin sheet trembling in his hand, as though even it didn't believe the words printed on its surface. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't reach for the paper. He simply let his gaze rest on Eddie, then slide slowly back to Judith, as if silently asking if this truly was the best they could muster. The pause was deliberate. Silence was a weapon, and Malcolm wielded it with the ease of a man who had spent years interrogating cartel lieutenants, men who thought shouting and fists were power. He knew silence cut deeper than any raised voice, and in that silence the performance cracked a little further. Sean, still clutching the edge of his ill-fitting vest, shifted uneasily, his eyes darting not toward Malcolm, but toward the growing audience across the street. Curtains weren't just twitching, now windows were sliding open. A woman in a floral robe stood openly on her porch, phone raised. 2 houses down, a man in a baseball cap leaned against his railing, arms folded, watching with the wary curiosity of someone who knew something was about to break. Judith mistook the silence for weakness. Her voice grew louder, shriller, each accusation stacking on the last like bricks in a wall she was determined to build between Malcolm and the rest of the community. "You think you can ignore rules because of who you are?" She snapped, the words spilling out sharper now. "Do you believe you're better than the rest of us? That you can mock the standards this neighborhood has worked so hard to maintain? Driveways must remain uniform. That's regulation. Fees must be paid on time. That's regulation. Visitors must not disrupt the quiet order of our streets. That is regulation. And you," she jabbed a finger toward Malcolm. Her face flushed with indignation. "You have flouted every one of these with arrogance." The irony was palpable. Malcolm didn't need to argue. The neighbors could already hear the absurdity in her words. Driveway cracks, late fees, guests arriving, too often these were inconveniences at best, not crimes. To parade them as charges deserving of detention was to expose the farce for what it was. He inhaled slowly, the morning air cool against his lungs, his body language composed, steady, unshaken. Eddie, eager to press, the moment waved the paper again, stepping close enough for the edge to flutter inches from Malcolm's chest. "You can come peacefully, Mr. Hayes," he growled, the muscles in his jaw twitching, "or we'll make this harder on you. These papers give us authority. We've got the right to hold you until real law enforcement gets here. Don't test us." His voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the effort it took to maintain the facade. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the document, then back to Eddie's face, his expression unchanged, calm, but edged with quiet steel. He didn't need to read the paper to know it was worthless. He could see it in the flimsy folds, in the lack of seal or stamp, in the way Eddie's fingers clenched it too tightly, as if sheer grip could lend it credibility. He had handled real warrants, real affidavits, signed by real judges, documents that carried the weight of the law. This was no such thing. This was theater, a prop waved like a talisman, meant to scare, meant to control. The neighbors could see it too. The woman in the floral robe whispered audibly to her husband, her voice carrying just enough for others to hear. "That's not real." Her husband muttered back, "He printed that off at home." Phones tilted, zooming in on the shaking paper, catching every wrinkle, every faded line of text that bore no official markings. Judith's jaw tightened as she realized the crowd was not buying the act. Her words grew sharper, more desperate, as if volume could replace legitimacy. "This neighborhood has rules," she shouted, her voice echoing down the block. "And when someone ignores them, there are consequences. That's how we maintain order. That's how we preserve respectability. Without enforcement, everything falls apart." The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. Order, respectability. These words spoken while two grown men stood in mismatched vests with Velcro straps dangling were less a defense of order than a confession of fear. She wasn't defending rules. She was defending her control. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying across the driveway, cutting through her shrillness like a blade through fog. "Driveways, fees, visitors. That's what you've brought men in tactical vests to enforce." He let the words hang, his calm tone sharper than any raised voice. "You think this gives you the right to trespass on my property and talk about detention?" The question wasn't meant for Judith alone. It was meant for everyone watching. The neighbors, the cameras, the silent jury scattered across porches and windows. And they heard it. They felt it. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft but unmistakable. This wasn't enforcement. It was harassment. It wasn't order. It was theater. Eddie stiffened his grip on the paper, tightening his pride, refusing to let go. "That's right," he snapped again, his tone brittle, cracking like ice under too much weight. "We've got authority. We can hold you. Don't make this difficult." But even as he said it, the illusion was thinning, dissolving under the weight of scrutiny. His mirrored shades no longer looked like a shield. They looked like a mask hiding doubt. Sean shifted again, his boots scraping nervously against the concrete, his eyes flicking between Malcolm's steady posture and the neighbors' raised phones. He knew the truth was slipping through their fingers, and Malcolm knew it too. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to brandish his badge, didn't need to call their bluff outright. He only needed to let them keep talking, keep overreaching, keep inflating their authority until the balloon popped on its own. Because that was the thing about counterfeit power, it always collapses under the weight of its own exaggeration. And on that quiet Saturday morning in Crestwood, as petty accusations were paraded like felonies and flimsy papers were waved like weapons, the collapse had already begun. The words were still hanging in the air: "Detain you until police arrive," when something in the atmosphere of Crestwood shifted. It wasn't dramatic at first. It began with the faintest ripple of fabric, the quiet swish of a curtain drawn back an inch or two, then another, and another. Within seconds, the still neighborhood that had been Malcolm Hayes's backdrop only moments earlier turned into something else entirely a stage. Eyes were appearing everywhere, peeking through blinds, squinting from bedroom windows, staring down from second-story balconies. The suburban silence had cracked, replaced by the quiet thrum of curiosity, sharpening into collective attention. Across the street, a screen door creaked, and a woman in a housecoat stepped out onto her porch, her toddler perched on her hip, her expression caught between confusion and suspicion. She wasn't alone. From 3 houses down, an older couple emerged shoulder to shoulder, Mr. and Mrs. Delgado, who had lived on the block for more than 30 years. Their arms folded in perfect symmetry as they leaned on their railing, watching as though the morning news had spilled live onto their own front lawn. The sound of a phone camera clicking on broke through the air, then another, then a third. Neighbors were no longer hiding their presence. They were recording, documenting, preparing to hold on to whatever unfolded. And then came the moment that truly transformed the confrontation into something bigger than a petty dispute. A voice rang out, young, excited, half-whispered and half-shouted. "Yo, I got you on live." It was Darius Coleman, the 15-year-old, who lived across from Malcolm's house, a lanky teenager whose basketball often thumped against Malcolm's driveway hoop in the late afternoons. Now he was standing barefoot on his front lawn, his phone raised high, the camera angled steady, as he spoke breathlessly into the stream. "Y'all check this out. This is happening right now in Crestwood. Dude tried to arrest Mr. Hayes. This is wild." The livestream changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just neighbors watching through their windows. This was an audience stretching far beyond the street. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of digital eyes pulling closer with every passing second. The neighborhood had become a theater, and Darius's phone was the stage light that illuminated every expression, every stumble, every word. Malcolm felt it. He didn't even need to glance at Darius to know what was happening. Years of experience had trained him to recognize when the air around him shifted, when visibility turned a private encounter into a public reckoning. He could feel the weight of every camera lens pressing in like invisible spotlights. He adjusted nothing. His stance remained steady. His hands, calm, his gaze, cool. But inside his mind was moving quickly. Cameras changed the calculus. Cameras made truth harder to bury. Cameras made lies collapse faster than fists ever could. Judith, on the other hand, was unraveling under the scrutiny. Her words, which had sounded sharp and commanding when it was just the 3 of them facing Malcolm, now rang brittle in the open air. She gestured toward Eddie, her voice pitched high enough for the audience she hadn't realized she had. "This man is in violation. He's undermining the standards we worked hard to build. We're doing what's necessary to protect the integrity of our neighborhood." But the neighbors weren't nodding. They weren't murmuring approval. They were whispering skepticism, their words carrying just enough to sting. "That's not real police," one man muttered from his porch. "Look at their vests. They don't even match." Another whispered to her sister, who was already zooming in with her phone. And from the stream itself came the flood of digital commentary, Darius's chat filling with lines that scrolled faster than his eyes could keep up. "Bro, they fake. Call the cops on the fake cops. This dude, Malcolm, is calm as hell. Is this even legal?" The world outside Crestwood was chiming in, watching in real time as truth and theater collided. Eddie, oblivious to how transparent he looked under the scrutiny, leaned harder into his performance. He waved the flimsy paper again, his voice sharp with a bravado already cracking. "We're in charge here. You don't get to decide the rules, Hayes. We've got authority, and if you don't comply, we'll escalate. You hear me? We'll escalate." He said it louder than before, not to convince Malcolm, but to drown out the murmurs rising from the street. Sean, however, was coming apart. His eyes darted everywhere but forward. The porch across from him, the phones in the air, the teenager shouting into his live stream. Every angle of this confrontation was being captured, every twitch immortalized in pixels. His hands trembled at his sides, his weight shifting from one foot to the other in a rhythm of unease. He had not signed up for this. He had not imagined that his role-playing as an enforcer would land him on half a dozen recording devices before the real police even arrived. He muttered under his breath just loud enough for Eddie to hear, "Man, I don't know about this." But Eddie wasn't listening. Eddie doubled down. He stepped closer, chest out shades reflecting Malcolm's face back at him, his tone sharp. "You either come with us, or we'll make this ugly." The neighborhood reacted instantly. From the Delgado's porch came a gasp. The woman in the housecoat shook her head, murmuring loudly enough for others to hear, "That's not right. He's threatening him." Phones tilted higher, capturing the step. The words the way Eddie's fingers twitched near the edge of his belt, like he wanted everyone to believe he was armed. And through it all, Malcolm remained still, calm, deliberate. His silence was louder than Eddie's bark, his composure more commanding than Judith's shrill orders. When he finally spoke, his voice cut clean through the chaos, low, but carrying enough for the block to hear. "This is your play. Driveway cracks, and late fees turned into a detention. You brought 2 men in knockoff vests to my house, and you think the law is on your side." He let the words hang, his calm tone slicing sharper than anger. "Look around you. Look at your audience. They see it. They hear it. Every camera out here is proof. So go ahead. Keep talking. Show them who you really are." The effect was immediate. Neighbors murmured louder, a chorus of disapproval threading through the air. Phones zoomed closer. Darius shouted into his live stream, "Yo, he's calm. He's calling them out. This is crazy, y'all. Share this, share this now." Judith's cheeks flushed a deep red. Her jaw tightened, her arms crossing tighter against her chest. She tried to seize the narrative back, raising her voice to a shriek. "Don't listen to him. He's twisting the truth. These men are here because this community needs discipline. Because people like him think they're untouchable." The words slipped sharp and ugly, "people like him." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had been silent whispered more openly, now some voices carrying across the street. "We heard that. What does she mean by that?" Phones swung from Eddie and Sean back to Judith, zooming in on her flushed face, her trembling lips. The stage had shifted. What was meant to be Malcolm's trial had become Judith's exposure. Her accusations meant to paint him as a violator were collapsing into caricature under the eyes of her own neighbors. Her enforcers meant to intimidate now looked like props in a collapsing play. And Malcolm, the man she had intended to corner, stood unshaken at the center of it all, his silence louder than her shouting, his calm presence more commanding than their costumes. What began as curtains twitching had transformed into something undeniable. The block was no longer just a set of houses, it was a courtroom, a stage, an arena of judgment. Every eye was a witness, every phone a gavel, every whisper a verdict forming in real time. And at the center stood Malcolm Hayes, steady and unflinching, letting the audience decide who truly carried authority on this quiet Texas street. The The weight of the crowd's eyes pressed harder with every second. Dozens of them scattered across porches, behind curtains, and glowing through the lenses of raised phones. The street itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire neighborhood knew that what happened next would not just settle a dispute over rules, but reveal who truly commanded authority on this block. Judith Kramer felt that weight too, though she misread it. To her, the murmurs weren't disapproval, they were opportunity. She mistook the scrutiny for legitimacy, the way a desperate performer believes applause is inevitable just because the audience is watching. Her voice rose sharply, slicing into the murmuring air. "Enough games, Malcolm. You've ignored warnings, you've ignored letters, and now you stand here mocking the authority of this neighborhood. If you resist, these men will escalate. Do you hear me? They will escalate." The word escalate cracked like a whip, though it echoed more as a threat than a promise. Eddie seized on it instantly, stepping forward with that same puffed chest bravado that looked thinner under the sunlight than it had in his bathroom mirror earlier that morning. His mirrored shades caught the reflection of Malcolm's still figure, but the glass couldn't hide the tension twitching at the corners of his mouth. "She's right." Eddie barked, the paper still trembling in his hand. "You're already in violation, Hayes. Don't make it worse for yourself. Don't force us to take you down harder than it has to be." He lifted his chin, his body language loud, but his voice betrayed the tiniest crack. It was the sound of a man bluffing a gambler, pushing all his chips forward on a hand he knew was weak. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't flinch. His silence stretched long enough for the neighbors' murmurs to grow louder, long enough for Darius Coleman across the street to lean closer to his phone and whisper into his stream, "Y'all, they're threatening him now. But look at Mr. Hayes. He's not even sweating. Man's ice cold." And then Malcolm spoke. Calm, steady. Each word measured like a scalpel, not a hammer. "Escalate." He repeated his tone, carrying more weight than Eddie's bark. "Let me explain something to you, since you seem confused about what authority really is." He lifted his hand slightly, not as a gesture of aggression, but of instruction, as though he were addressing a classroom rather than two imposters on his driveway. "Right now, the three of you are trespassing on private property. That alone is a violation of law. On top of that, His gaze shifted to Eddie and Sean, his voice tightening by a fraction, "are impersonating law enforcement. Federal statute makes that a felony. Minimum of 3 years in prison, if you're lucky. And when you add the words detain and escalate to the mix, what you're describing is unlawful restraint. Another felony. That's what you're standing on right now. Not authority. Not law. Felonies." The words rolled out precise, unshaken, the kind of language that cut deeper because it was factual, because it left no room for bluster. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to point fingers. He only needed to let the law itself speak through his calm tone. The crowd reacted before Eddie could. Gasps rippled across the porch's, murmurs rising higher, now words tumbling over each other. He's right. That's a crime. They could go to jail for this. The neighborhood had gone from spectators to a jury deliberating in real time, and every phone lifted higher, every angle recorded sharper. Eddie bristled his body, stiffening as though his muscles could compensate for the weakness in his position. He jabbed a finger toward Malcolm, his voice cracking on the edges. "You don't get to lecture us. You're the one breaking rules here, not us. You're the one who thinks he's above everyone else. We're just doing our job." "Your job," Malcolm interrupted, his voice calm but edged with steel. He stepped half a pace forward, his presence suddenly towering without him needing to raise his voice. "You have no job here. You have no badge, no oath, no authority. You're standing on my driveway in second-hand vests, waving fake papers and pretending you carry the weight of law. But you don't. The law isn't cosplay. It isn't intimidation. It's accountability. And you're standing here in violation of it. The neighbors stirred again louder this time, their voices sharper. Someone shouted from across the street, "He's right. Y'all don't look official at all." Another voice chimed in, "This is a scam. You can't just arrest somebody." Phones tilted toward Eddie and Sean, zooming in on the cracks in their performance. Judith tried to seize control again, her voice sharp with desperation. "Don't listen to him," she snapped, spinning toward the neighbors as though she could still rally them. "He's twisting everything. These men are here to protect our community. He's dangerous. He thinks the rules don't apply to him. That's why we had to step in." But her words landed weaker now. They didn't sound like authority, they sounded like excuse. The neighbors weren't nodding. They were shaking their heads, whispering louder, their skepticism plain. And Malcolm seized on that shift, his voice dropping lower, calmer still, forcing everyone to lean in to hear. "You see what she's doing?" he said, not to Judith but to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the porches and cameras. "She's confusing control with leadership. She thinks shouting rules makes her powerful. But rules without law, without accountability, are nothing but intimidation. And intimidation isn't order, it's chaos." The words hit their mark. Even Sean felt them. His shoulders sagged visibly, his jaw tightening as doubt bled across his features. He glanced at Eddie, then at Judith, then back at Malcolm as though searching for an escape hatch he knew didn't exist. His voice slipped out low, uncertain, but audible enough in the hushed street. "Maybe we should. Maybe we should wait. This doesn't feel right." Eddie snapped his head toward him, his voice a hissed whisper meant only for Sean, but loud enough for others to catch. "Shut up. Don't lose it now." But Sean couldn't hide it anymore. His hands trembled at his sides, his breathing shallow, his eyes flicking constantly toward the phones recording every second. He knew Malcolm was right. He knew trespass impersonation and unlawful restraint weren't just words, they were charges. Real charges. Felonies. He had not signed up for this. Malcolm saw it too. He had spent decades reading people dissecting lies, catching tells. He could see Sean folding under the weight of truth. And he pressed just enough to widen the crack. "You know it, don't you?" he said softly, his eyes locking on Sean. "You know this isn't legal. You know you're standing on the wrong side of the line. And here's the thing about lines, they don't move for you. You either step back, or you get buried under the law." Sean swallowed hard, his throat, bobbing, his lips parting, as if to answer, but no words came. The silence was its own confession. Judith's face flushed deeper, her hands balling into fists. She spun toward Sean, her voice shrieking desperate. "Don't listen to him! He's manipulating you! He's the one in the wrong here!" But the crowd wasn't convinced. Their murmurs rose, their voices no longer neutral, but leaning firmly against her. "She's lying. This is harassment. Mr. Hayes is right." The tide was turning, and everyone could feel it. Eddie, still clinging to his illusion of power, barked again, louder, harsher, trying to drown out the chorus. "This is your last warning. Hayes, come with us now, or it gets ugly." But even as he said it, his bravado faltered. His voice cracked on the last word. His stance wasn't as steady as it had been minutes earlier. His authority, such as it was eroding with every syllable. And Malcolm didn't need to shout, didn't need to posture. He simply stood there, calm as stone, his voice quiet but devastating. "No, Eddie. This is your last warning. Trespass, impersonation, unlawful restraint. Those are the words that will follow you if you take another step. And when the real police arrive, and they won't be asking me the hard questions. They'll be asking you." The crowd hummed louder, a ripple of agreement swelling like a wave. Sean's resolve cracked further, his eyes dropping to the ground. Eddie's jaw clenched, his pride battling the truth, pressing in on all sides. And Judith, red-faced and trembling, realized the authority she had clung to so tightly was slipping through her fingers like sand. On Crestwood's quiet street, the war of words was already decided. Control had shouted, but law had spoken, and the neighborhood knew the difference. The standoff teetered on a knife's edge, the air in Crestwood heavy with tension that seemed to press down on every porch, every window, every recording phone. Eddie's chest rose and fell sharply, his pride inflating him like a balloon stretched too thin. Malcolm's calm dismantling of their so-called authority had punctured the illusion, and the murmurs of the neighborhood jury were growing louder, sharper, unmistakably against Judith and her two impostors. Sean's doubt was written across his trembling hands, his eyes darting from Malcolm's steady face to the glowing lenses that captured his every twitch. Judith's shrill insistence was faltering the confidence she had clung to, now bleeding into desperation. And that was when Eddie made his most reckless choice, the decision that would turn the confrontation from a war of words into a flashpoint. With a sudden motion, Eddie shoved his hand into the side pocket of his vest and pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. The metallic clank rang out across the driveway, a sound so out of place in the calm Texas morning that it cut through the neighborhood like a gunshot. Every phone lifted higher, every whisper silenced. The cuffs gleamed cold and silver under the rising sun, their weight heavier in symbolism than in steel. Eddie held them up like a weapon, his voice booming as he declared, "You're under citizen arrest. Don't make me put these on you the hard way." The words were ridiculous, absurd. Even but under the gravity of the moment, they landed like a threat with teeth. The crowd gasped audibly. Mrs. Delgado pressed a hand to her mouth. The woman in the housecoat hugged her toddler closer, and Darius Coleman's voice cracked with disbelief into his live stream. "Oh my God, he's got cuffs. He's actually trying to cuff Mr. Hayes." Malcolm's eyes flicked to the handcuffs, then back to Eddie's face. He didn't step back, didn't raise his hands, didn't let the threat command his posture. Instead, he stood rooted in place, his voice steady, measured, devastating, in its calm precision. "If you take one more step toward me with those cuffs," he said, his tone low enough to quiet the murmurs, but loud enough to carry across every porch, "you are committing a federal felony. Impersonating law enforcement, attempted unlawful restraint. Minimum 3 years in prison, if you're lucky." The words landed like a hammer. 3 years. The phrase repeated itself in the murmurs that spread across the crowd. 3 years in prison. Neighbors shook their heads, muttering disapproval. He's right. That's a crime. What are they thinking? Phones zoomed closer to the cuffs, to Eddie's trembling hand, to Malcolm's unflinching face. Eddie stiffened, gripping the cuffs tighter, but his bravado cracked under the pressure of Malcolm's words. His mirrored shades reflected the neighborhood jury back at him. The phones, the eyes, the judgment. And for the first time, he seemed to falter. His hand shook slightly, the cuffs rattling against each other with a metallic clink that betrayed his insecurity. Sean's voice broke the silence, low but desperate. "Eddie, this is crazy. We can't actually cuff him. He just said it. This is federal. We'll get locked up ourselves." His words weren't just fear, they were confession. His knees bent as if he were preparing to step back to escape the hole Judith and Eddie had dragged him into. But Eddie snapped his head toward him, his voice harsh and cracking. "Shut up, Sean. I've got this." His pride was louder than his reason, his desperation clinging to the only weapon he had left, the illusion of control clutched in his trembling hand. Judith, red-faced and trembling, tried to rally the performance. She raised her chin, projecting her voice as though volume could still sway the crowd. "Don't let him scare you," she shouted, her tone shrill. "This is a law-abiding community. We have every right to enforce standards. He's just trying to bully his way out of consequences. Put the cuffs on him, Eddie. Show this neighborhood who's in charge." But her words backfired. The crowd gasped, then murmured louder, sharper, angrier. Someone shouted from across the street, "You don't have the right, Judith." Another voice followed quickly. "This isn't enforcement, it's harassment." The tide of judgment was turning openly now, the neighbors no longer silent witnesses, but vocal jurors delivering their verdict in real time. Phones tilted toward Judith, capturing her flushed face, her desperate commands, her unraveling authority. Malcolm seized the moment, his voice dropping lower, calmer still, forcing the silence to lean in closer. "Listen to me carefully, Eddie," he said, his gaze locked on the man's trembling hands. "I've used real cuffs on real criminals, and I know what I'm looking at right now. You're bluffing. You're holding onto a piece of steel like it will give you power, but it won't. The second you lay a finger on me, your life as you know it is over. Every phone here will show the world who you are, and the real police won't be asking me the hard questions, they'll be booking you. Drop them. Now." The words cut through Eddie's bravado like glass under pressure. His jaw clenched, his lips pressed together, but his arm hesitated, trembling, the cuffs rattling audibly in the quiet. The crowd murmured louder, their disapproval now tinged with disgust. "He's right. Drop it. Don't be stupid. You're done, man." Judith, desperate, shouted again, her voice cracking. "Don't let him intimidate you, Eddie. Put the cuffs on. Do it now." Her words only deepened the outrage. A middle-aged man 3 houses down shouted back, "Linda, you've lost your damn mind." Another voice rose. "This is insane. You're exposing yourself." The crowd's tide was no longer neutral. It was firmly against Judith and her enforcers. Sean's resolve broke entirely. He muttered harshly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm out. I didn't sign up for this." He ripped the Velcro patch from his vest and tossed it onto the driveway. The cheap fabric fluttered like a confession, landing flat at Malcolm's feet. Gasps rippled across the neighborhood. Phones zoomed in. The illusion was unraveling one stitch at a time. Malcolm's gaze shifted back to Eddie, his voice quiet, intimate, sharp as a blade. "That's one down. What about you?" Eddie's hands shook harder now, the cuffs rattling against his thigh, his pride at war with the reality collapsing around him. Sweat beaded along his forehead, glistening under the Texas sun. His mirrored shades could no longer hide the fear in his eyes. The crowd murmured again, voices rising into a chorus. "Drop it. You're done. Walk away, man." Even Darius's livestream caught the swell of judgment, his voice crackling into the mic, everyone's telling him to stop. He's not gonna win this. Mr. Hayes already won. For a long moment, the scene hung in fragile balance, the cuffs glinting in Eddie's trembling hand, Judith shrieking commands that no one obeyed, Sean retreating into shame, and Malcolm standing steady, unflinching, calm as stone. The handcuffs, once meant to symbolize control, now symbolized collapse. And with every rattle of steel, with every murmur of disapproval, the truth became undeniable. The illusion of authority was crumbling, and the reckoning had already begun. The steel handcuffs dangled in Eddie's trembling grip, the clink of metal echoing like a countdown no one could stop. Sweat beaded on his forehead, sliding down the sharp line of his jaw, as his chest heaved with the weight of pride colliding against fear. Judith Kramer's shrill voice tore across the driveway again, desperate, unrelenting. "Do it, Eddie! Don't back down! Now, put the cuffs on him. Show this neighborhood who's in charge." Her command cracked through the air, but it was no longer met with agreement. The neighbors murmured in outrage, heads shaking, voices rising in protest. Phones tilted higher lenses, catching every twitch of her face, every drop of sweat rolling down Eddie's temples. The illusion was gone. What had begun as a petty display of control now teetered on the edge of implosion. Sean had already broken, ripping his Velcro patch free and tossing it to the ground in surrender. The crowd had turned from silent witnesses to vocal jurors, their murmurs like a chorus rising against Judith's facade. But Eddie, his pride, would not let him retreat. His knuckles whitened around the cuffs, his jaw clenching hard enough to tremble. His shades hid his eyes, but his body language screamed defiance. He had nothing left to cling to but the illusion of dominance. And in a flash of reckless desperation, he lunged. It happened fast, too fast for the untrained eye to follow, but not too fast for Malcolm Hayes. Years of experience had trained his instincts sharper than reflex, honed his movements into second nature. When Eddie surged forward, clumsy with rage, Malcolm didn't recoil. He stepped sideways, his body slipping out of the trajectory with fluid precision. His hand shot up, seizing Eddie's wrist before the cuffs could swing forward. In a single motion, he twisted, redirecting the momentum. Eddie stumbled, his chest lurching forward as Malcolm pivoted behind him. The cuffs clattered against the driveway, once then snapped shut, not on Malcolm, but on Eddie's own wrists, the steel locking with a decisive click that rang louder than Judith's frantic shouts. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. To the neighbors, it looked like choreography, a rehearsed sequence executed with surgical grace. One moment, Eddie was lunging, all puffed-up bravado. The next, he was on his knees, cuffed, his breath ragged with disbelief. Gasps erupted across the street, sharp and collective, followed by the buzz of 100 voices rising at once. Mrs. Delgado's hand flew to her chest. Darius Coleman's livestream crackled with his shout, "Oh my God!" He flipped it. He cuffed him in like 2 seconds flat. Did y'all see that? Phones zoomed in, capturing Eddie's stunned face as he knelt on the pavement, his wrists locked tight behind him, his pride shattered into pieces for the entire block to see. Malcolm held him steady with minimal force, his expression calm, professional, untouched by the heat of adrenaline. He didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't speak right away. He simply stood over Eddie with the quiet authority of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Judith's scream split the air. "What are you doing? You can't arrest him. You don't have that power." Her voice cracked into panic, shrill and broken, her face flushed with fury. She was trembling, her authority evaporating faster than the sweat dripping down Eddie's face. Her shriek rang hollow, bouncing off the brick houses like the echoes of a performer long past her cue. Malcolm's gaze cut to her sharp as glass, his voice slicing clean through her denial. "You're right, Judith. I can't arrest him." His tone was calm, even deliberate. "But I can detain him for impersonating an officer. I can detain him for attempted unlawful restraint. And I can hold him until the real police arrive. That's lawful. What you did here today, that's criminal." The murmurs surged into a wave. Neighbors shook their heads, muttered words of agreement, raised their phones higher. Someone shouted, "She set this up." Another voice followed louder. "You pushed them too far." Judith, the tide of judgment had turned fully, unmistakably. The block was no longer her audience, it was her jury, and the verdict was written on their faces. Sean stood frozen near the curb, his patchless vest sagging on his shoulders, his hands raised in helpless surrender. His voice cracked thick with regret. "I didn't touch anybody. I'm out, man. I'm done. I didn't sign up for this." He looked like he wanted to disappear into the asphalt, and Malcolm, calm, composed, steady, finally reached into his back pocket. With one hand, he held Eddie restrained. With the other, he pulled out a worn leather wallet. He flipped it open with practiced ease, raising it high enough for the crowd, the cameras, and even Judith to see. The gold badge glinted in the sunlight, gleaming sharp against the Texas morning. His voice carried calm but undeniable. "I am Senior Special Agent Malcolm Hayes, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The street went silent. The murmurs collapsed into stunned stillness, the only sounds the ragged breaths of Eddie kneeling on the driveway, and the faint whir of Darius's phone capturing every pixel of the moment. The badge gleamed like a verdict, a revelation that rewrote the entire scene. Gasps erupted seconds later, scattered across the block. Mrs. Delgado whispered hoarsely to her husband, "I knew it. I knew he carried himself different." The woman in the housecoat clutched her toddler closer, her eyes wide. From the livestream comments flooded Darius's screen faster than he could read them. "FBI. No way, this is insane. Bro, he just flipped the script. This is going viral." Judith's face drained of color. Her lips trembled, her words stumbling over each other in frantic denial. No, this is abuse of power. You can't just pull out a badge and—" Malcolm cut her off with the calm precision of a gavel striking wood. Abuse of power. That's rich coming from the woman who staged a fake arrest over petty grievances. What I'm doing is lawful. What you did is criminal. His tone wasn't raised, but it carried sharper than any shout. The neighbors reacted instantly, their murmurs hardened into open disapproval. "She's finished. Unbelievable. We saw it all." Their phones captured her flushed face, her trembling lips, her unraveling composure. Malcolm adjusted his grip on Eddie, keeping him steady, his badge still raised high. His voice carried across the street, clear and cutting. "Let's be clear. This isn't about driveways or fees or visitors. This is about people pretending to have authority they don't. People who think intimidation is leadership. That ends today." The words landed like a verdict. Eddie groaned in humiliation, his head hanging low. Sean shuffled backward, his eyes wide with shame. Judith's body trembled, her voice caught in her throat. The block was no longer her audience. It was Malcolm's, and the story was no longer hers to tell. The power had reversed completely. What began as an attempted display of control by Judith and her imposters had become a lesson in real authority. Malcolm Hayes stood tall, steady, his badge gleaming, his words resonating across Crestwood. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten, didn't need to bluster. His composure, his training, his truth, that was power. And now, in front of dozens of neighbors and thousands of digital witnesses, that power had shifted forever. The moment hung suspended in Crestwood, like the pause before a thunderclap. Eddie knelt on the driveway, wrists bound in the very cuffs he had meant for Malcolm Hayes, his bravado drained into the concrete beneath him. Sean hovered on the curb vest, sagging without its patch, his hands twitching nervously as though he could peel himself out of the spectacle entirely. Judith Kramer stood rigid, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts, her lips trembling as the weight of exposure pressed down. And Malcolm, calm, composed, unflinching, held his badge high in the morning light, its golden glint silencing the crowd into stunned awe. For one long, breathless beat, the only sound was the faint chirp of cicadas in the distance. Then, breaking through the silence, came the sirens. They started faint, A distant wail carried by the hot Texas air then grew louder, sharper, undeniable. Red and blue lights flickered against the tops of trees at the far end of the block, painting the leaves in pulsing color. Tires crunched over asphalt, as the first patrol car rounded the corner, followed closely by a second. The quiet street that had already transformed into a stage now became something closer to a courtroom with official gavel strikes, the arrival of real law. Neighbors shifted on porches, whispers rippling like a wave. Phones tilted higher to capture the flashing lights, the uniforms stepping out, the moment when theater collided with reality. The first officer out of the car was broad-shouldered, his jaw set in a professional line, his eyes scanning the scene quickly. The second officer, younger, sharper-eyed, followed at his side, her hand brushing the grip of her holstered weapon, as protocol demanded. They moved with measured caution, every step, the deliberate rhythm of training. "Hands where we can see them!" The broad officer barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Malcolm immediately complied, raising one hand while keeping the other firm on Eddie's restrained arm. His tone was calm, precise. "Officers, I am Senior Special Agent Malcolm Hayes, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Badge is in my pocket, identification ready." The man in my custody attempted to impersonate law enforcement and assaulted me on my property. The officers froze mid-step, eyes darting from the glint of the badge in Malcolm's hand to Eddie's restrained form, then to the sea of phones recording every angle. The younger officer stepped forward, her voice steady but curious. "Sir, let's see your credentials." With practiced ease, Malcolm shifted, pulling his ID wallet free and handing it over without ever releasing control of Eddie. The broad officer flipped it open, his eyes, scanning quickly his posture, shifting almost instantly from suspicion to respect. He passed it to his partner, who confirmed with a sharp nod. The change in the air was palpable. Authority had shifted hands once more, from imposters to real officers, from theater to truth. "All right, Agent Hayes," the broad officer said firmly, handing the wallet back. "We'll take him from here." Relief rippled across the crowd, audible in murmurs and exhalations. Phones zoomed in as the officers stepped forward, lifting Eddie to his feet with professional precision. Eddie's face was flushed red, sweat dripping down his temple, his jaw tight with humiliation as the cuffs dug into his own wrists. The neighbors whispered, some with disbelief, some with grim satisfaction. "He's done. Serves him right. Never thought I'd see this on our street." Sean, meanwhile, raised his hands quickly, his voice spilling out in a rush. "I didn't touch him. I didn't do anything. I'll tell you everything. Judith set this up. She brought us here. She told us it was legal. I swear, I didn't know it would go this far." His words cracked, desperate, but they carried the ring of confession. The younger officer moved toward him, her eyes sharp. "We'll need your statement. Don't move." Sean nodded furiously, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. "I'll cooperate. I'll tell you everything. Just don't cuff me, please." Judith's voice shrieked across the driveway, shrill with panic. "No, he's lying. This is all twisted. You don't understand. I was just protecting the community. This is my duty as neighborhood chief." But her words rang hollow, bouncing off brick walls with no power left to cling to. The broad officer turned his gaze on her, his tone firm. "Ma'am, did you authorize these men to act as law enforcement?" Judith blinked, her lips parting, no words, ready to defend what she already knew was indefensible. The crowd murmured louder, their voices sharp, now condemning. "We saw it. She told them to. This is on her." The younger officer stepped closer, her tone sharper. "Ma'am, we have multiple witnesses, and from what I see, this looks very bad for you. We'll need you to come with us and provide a statement downtown. If you resist, we'll treat it as obstruction." Judith's shoulders sagged. her face pale, her eyes darting frantically toward the neighbors who had once feared her, but now looked at her with disgust. She stammered, her voice cracking. You can't arrest me. I'm the neighborhood chief. They know me. They'll side with me." Malcolm's voice cut across hers, calm but devastating. "That title doesn't put you above the law, Judith. If anything, it means you should have known better." The neighbors erupted in murmurs again, louder this time, fueled by agreement. Phones tilted to capture the moment Judith's authority collapsed in full. The younger officer placed a steady hand on her arm. "Ma'am, you need to step aside and come with us. Now." Judith resisted at first, pulling back, but the officer's grip tightened just enough to show she had no choice. Gasps rippled, then a sharp murmur of satisfaction. It's about time. She had it coming. She went too far. Eddie was loaded into the back of the first squad car, his head bowed, his shades gone, his face streaked with humiliation. Sean was pulled aside, given a pad to write down his statement, his voice trembling as he repeated the same words, "I'll tell you everything." She set this up. And Judith, the once proud neighborhood chief, was guided toward the second car, her face pale, her eyes wide, her lips still trembling with words no one believed anymore. The flashing lights painted Crestwood in red and blue reflections, dancing across the windows of brick homes, across the lenses of dozens of phones still recording. Children clung to their parents, whispering questions, their wide eyes learning in real time that authority could be faked, that power could be abused, but also that truth had a way of cutting through performance. Malcolm stood near his steps, his posture steady, his expression calm but unyielding. He hadn't moved far since the moment Eddie lunged. He hadn't needed to. His composure radiated more authority than Judith's shouting or Eddie's bluster ever could. And now, as the real police sealed the scene, the neighbors turned their gazes toward him with something new in their eyes: respect, gratitude, awe. Officer Ramirez, the broad man, approached Malcolm, his tone respectful now. "Agent Hayes, appreciate your cooperation. From what I see, you handled this situation by the book." Malcolm gave a slight nod, his voice low but steady. "My goal was to keep it from escalating further. He came at me with cuffs. I had no choice but to detain him until you arrived." Ramirez sighed, glancing toward the squad cars where Eddie and Judith sat in separate compartments. "Well, the good news is everything's on tape between the neighbors' recordings and our body cams. It's a pretty airtight case. Impersonation, unlawful restraint, trespassing, conspiracy. The DA will sort the rest." Malcolm's gaze swept across the block, lingering on the neighbors, with their phones still raised, their whispers still swirling. "Don't forget instigation," he said evenly, his eyes locking briefly with Judith through the glass of the squad car window. She flinched, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. Ramirez followed his gaze, then nodded. "We're not ignoring her role." The crowd hummed again, satisfied, murmuring words of agreement. "He's right. She pushed this. She thought she was untouchable." The patrol cars idled, engines low but steady their lights, painting Crestwood's quiet morning in streaks of judgment and change. One by one, the neighbors lowered their phones, some whispering, some clapping softly, others simply staring still, trying to process what they had witnessed. And Malcolm Hayes, the man they had once known only as the quiet neighbor, with the steady wave, now stood revealed in full light, Senior Special Agent FBI. The man who had refused to be bullied, who had turned the illusion of authority on its head, who had shown an entire neighborhood what real power looked like. The imposters were gone, the sirens fading, the flashing lights retreating down the street. But the lesson remained carved into the memory of every neighbor who had watched the spectacle unfold. Intimidation collapses under truth, and fake authority always meets its reckoning. When the flashing lights finally disappeared from Crestwood and the last squad car turned the corner with Eddie slumped in the back seat and Judith trembling in another, the street exhaled a long collective breath. The neighbors lingered on porches and sidewalks, whispering, pointing, replaying the incredible spectacle in their minds. For years, Judith Kramer had ruled this neighborhood with petty threats and stiffly written letters. For a half hour that Saturday morning, she had tried to elevate herself into something more, staging an illusion of authority with two imposters in mismatched vests. But the truth had torn through her performance, and everyone on that street had witnessed the collapse. They thought the story might end there. They were wrong. It was only the beginning. By Sunday afternoon, the first clips surfaced on local Facebook groups. Darius Coleman's live stream shaky at first, but capturing every crucial moment, the clinking handcuffs, Malcolm's calm warning of a 3-year felony, the flash of his badge was cut, clipped, and shared faster than wildfire under a dry Texas sky. By Monday morning, one video had been viewed 200,000 times. By Monday night, it had crossed 1 million. Headlines spread from Dallas to Houston, then beyond the state. FBI agent turns tables on fake neighborhood enforcers. Local chief accused of orchestrating impersonation scheme. Authority versus intimidation. Viral video sparks debate on abuse of power. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear of Judith now walked to their mailboxes with shoulders squared, emboldened by the weight of exposure. Parents replayed the video for their children at kitchen tables, teaching them about the difference between real authority and intimidation. Teachers at Crestwood Elementary wove the story into class discussions: why rules matter, who gets to enforce them, and what courage looks like when truth is on the line. For Judith, the fallout was swift. By Tuesday evening, the neighborhood board held an emergency meeting at the community center. The room was packed, every seat filled, every wall lined with residents who had once avoided confrontation but now demanded accountability. Phones buzzed recording the proceedings. When Judith attempted to defend herself, her voice quivering as she claimed she had only wanted to protect the standards of Crestwood, she was met with boos, headshakes, and a chorus of disbelief. The vote to remove her as neighborhood chief was unanimous, the final tally announced with the solemnity of a verdict. Her chair sat empty by Wednesday morning, a symbol of her collapse. In her place, the community moved toward something humbler, fairer. A retired school principal named Harold Jennings, a quiet man in his 70s, known for mediating disputes with patience rather than threats, was nominated to lead in the interim. His first words were simple: "This neighborhood doesn't need enforcers. It needs neighbors." Applause filled the hall louder than anyone could remember hearing at a community meeting. But the true moment of healing came later that week, when the neighbors gathered in the park for a special meeting under the fading orange glow of the Friday sunset. Families brought folding chairs, children ran in the grass, and nearly every household sent someone. For once, Crestwood wasn't divided by fences and whispers, it was united, buzzing with anticipation. And when Malcolm Hayes arrived, the crowd hushed, as though the man they had known only as a polite neighbor had become something more, both protector and teacher. He didn't stand on a stage or raise his voice above the crowd. He simply stepped forward, his presence commanding in its steadiness, and spoke with the same calm clarity that had dismantled Eddie's bravado days earlier. What happened last Saturday, he began, his voice carrying in the evening air, wasn't just about me. It wasn't even just about Judith or Eddie or Sean. It was about what happens when fear is mistaken for leadership, when intimidation is dressed up as authority. And the truth is, this community deserves better. The crowd murmured, nodding, leaning closer. Phones rose again, recording not out of suspicion, but out of reverence. Real authority. Malcolm continued, his tone steady. As stone doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten it. Doesn't hide behind fake vests or forged papers. Real authority protects. It serves. It answers to the law and to the people it claims to represent. Anything less, anything built on intimidation and control, collapses the moment it's exposed. He paused, letting the words sink into the silence, into the hearts of his neighbors. That's the lesson here. Not just for me, for all of us. Applause rippled across the park, soft at first, then louder, building into cheers. Parents lifted their children, whispering, "Listen to him." The teenagers in the back, including Darius, with his ever-ready phone, nodded with something like pride. He raised his camera again, live-streaming once more, this time not a confrontation, but a lesson. "Y'all hear this," he said into the mic. "This is what leadership sounds like. This is what real power looks like." By the weekend, Malcolm's words joined the viral clips already circling the nation. News anchors replayed the moment he revealed his badge, then cut to his speech in the park, framing it as a parable about trust, authority, and accountability. Commentators debated the implications. How many Judiths existed across the country, wielding intimidation under the guise of order? How many neighborhoods had been silenced by fear until someone refused to bow? But for Crestwood itself, the lesson was simpler, sharper, and far more personal. The block that had once peered through curtains with suspicion now greeted one another openly. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years lingered at fences to chat. Children played basketball in the street without parents pulling them inside. The fear that had hung over the block like a shadow was gone, replaced by a sense of trust that hadn't existed for years. And through it all, one detail became legend: the live stream. Darius Coleman's shaky, excited narration was replayed more than any polished news clip remembered, not just for its viral reach, but for what it symbolized. A teenager with a phone had captured the truth, had ensured accountability, had turned a quiet street into a national lesson. To the kids in Crestwood, he was a hero, too proof that even the smallest voices could make a difference when they dared to record, to share, to speak. For Malcolm, the aftermath was quieter. He didn't seek interviews, didn't bask in the attention. When a national morning show sent a crew to his front lawn, he politely declined, saying only, "This wasn't about me. It was about accountability." Then he went back to mowing his grass, carrying his trash to the curb, waving to neighbors who now waved back with gratitude and respect. Still, when he stood on his porch in the evenings, coffee in hand, watching children laugh in the fading light and neighbors chatting across driveways, he allowed himself a small smile. The confrontation had left scars, yes, but it had also sparked something stronger, a community rediscovering itself. The block had begun to rebuild, not on fear, but on trust, and he knew deep down that was the real victory. The truth always comes to light. That was the lesson. And in Crestwood, thanks to a Saturday morning, a trembling pair of handcuffs, a live stream, and the quiet authority of a man who refused to be intimidated, the light had never shone brighter. What unfolded on that quiet Saturday morning in Crestwood, Texas, is more than just a neighborhood drama. It's a mirror held up to America. A woman who mistook intimidation for leadership tried to weaponize fear, and two men wrapped themselves in counterfeit authority, believing silence would protect them. But silence broke. One voice stood firm, one teenager raised his phone, and within 48 hours, millions of people across this nation were talking about what they had witnessed: the difference between real power and fake power. The lesson is clear: real authority protects, it does not intimidate. Real leadership serves, it does not control. And real accountability comes not when people stay silent, but when they stand together. We live in a country of more than 330 million citizens spread across 50 states in communities large and small. Every street, every town, every block faces the same choice. Crestwood faced that morning. Do we bow to fear, or do we demand accountability? Do we let those who shout the loudest define our order, or do we remember that the law belongs to all of us? Equally, the truth is, intimidation only works when good people look away. But when neighbors raise their voices, when teenagers like Darius livestream the truth, when ordinary citizens refuse to be bullied, fear loses its grip. That's not just a neighborhood lesson, it's a national one. And it's why stories like this matter. They remind us that power without accountability is a fraud, and that justice, though sometimes quiet, will always rise when people refuse to surrender their dignity. So if this story made you think, if it made you pause, if it reminded you of what kind of America we must fight to preserve, then don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we have more stories that reveal what happens when ordinary people stand against abuse of power. Like this video, so more citizens see it in their feed, and share it with friends, family, and colleagues, because accountability is not a solo act, it's a collective one. In a world where lies can travel in seconds, let's make truth travel faster. Together we can make sure every community, every citizen, every voice remembers authority is earned through service, not demanded through fear.